Well, I was expecting a beautiful Mother's Day song. Did you see the title? That's a scary title, isn't it? I, over the years, think I've heard more negative stories about mother-in-laws than I've heard positive stories about mother-in-laws. How about you? Well, this morning, I'm going to tell you a positive mother-in-law story. We're going to go way back in the Old Testament to a little tiny book called Ruth. Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. If you'd like to turn back with me to that book. We're going to spend a little time just getting background, and then we'll get to the sermon and see a mother-in-law ideal. Okay, we're going back to Ruth. We're going to go to chapter 1. This is background story. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now, Moab was not a country a Jewish person would want to live in. Moab was an idolatrous country. They had idolatrous ways. They did things they thought was normal, but Jewish people didn't do. It's contrary to the character of God. Normally, a good Jewish man would never consider moving to Moab. So that tells us something about this man. He apparently wasn't what we'd call a real religious person. Religion was sort of peripheral to him. It wasn't real significant. And he saw a business opportunity in Moab that he felt he just couldn't turn down, so probably against his wife's wishes, we'll discuss that more in a little bit, he took his wife and 2 children and they moved to this idolatrous country called Moab. I don't know whether Elimelech considered the chances he was taking or not, but I'm sure Naomi did. Probably Elimelech had justified this move to Moab by saying, it's only temporary. We won't stay there long. We'll just stay there as long as this times are hard in Israel. Now in verse 2, we're told the man's name. In fact, we're told all the names. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab, and what? Remained there. Elimelech and his 2 sons liked living in Moab. Going there maybe have been an error in judgment, but remaining there was a judgment of the heart, was a choice of the heart. A true Israelite would have felt the desire to return to his homeland. But apparently, Elimelech, his 2 sons, found life in Moab attractive, pleasant. satisfying. And maybe they were prosperous in Moab. We don't know. But anyhow, they chose to remain there. Now, we're not told how Naomi felt. In those days, I'm sorry to say that women's desires were not considered too important. The women almost always had to go where the men in their lives led them, because it was the men who made the living, and there was very little chance for a woman to make a living in those days on her own. There is some evidence later in the story we'll get to that would tell us that, or influence us to believe that the decision was primarily Elimelech's and maybe his two sons. I wish we knew how old those two boys were, but we don't. And then we read tragedy strikes in verse 3. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her two sons. Now, I am supposing at this time her sons were old enough to make a living. They were old enough to work, and they were able to support their mother. And the two boys decided to stay in Moab. Probably if they were late teens or early 20s, they were already attracted to some Moabite ladies. Anyway, just when Elimelech felt secure, death came. He never intended for it to end this way. But lack of faith in the beginning started a process that continued until, for Elimelech, it was too late. Now, often a wrong move seems so little and insignificant, but it in times becomes a very big event. Mistakes almost always start small. And for Elimelech it did. Well, for Naomi, we have to recognize that being a widow meant hard times, generally. Unless those two boys had good jobs and was making a living. But apparently, no matter how Naomi felt about staying in Moab, the boys chose to stay. And we find that they were attracted to some Moabite women. Verse 4. Now the sons took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. We don't know when that 10 years began. We don't know whether the 10 years meant that from the time that Elimelech and his Naomi and the two sons moved to Moab or until the death of the two sons, or whether the 10 years started counting when the two boys got married. If the two boys got married and had been married for 10 years, you wonder why they didn't have any children. Normally, you don't wait 10 years to start having children. So that sort of leads us to think that the 10 years started when Elimelech moved to Moab, and it included all the years that they lived in Moab until they went back to Israel. This is important because we don't know how long those two daughters knew and had any kind of relationship with Naomi. We don't know. It could have been 10 years, or it could have been 10 months. Because we don't know when the 10 years started. We know when they ended, but we don't know when they started. We don't know how Naomi felt about those boys marrying Moabite women. But I can imagine her heart hurt. An Israelite mom would like to see her children, her boys, marrying Israelite women, not pagan Moabite women. So we're just sort of assuming. The Bible says they took wives, which would indicate that Naomi didn't have any choice in the matter. They didn't listen to her counsel. They weren't willing to go back to Israel and find Israelite wives. They liked what they saw in Moab, and they were here, and they wanted to get married and stay in Moab. It's very likely that Naomi didn't have anything to say about it. Her input wasn't recognized or accepted. We really don't know what kind of men those boys were. Boys tend to be influenced by their dad more than the mom, although I have seen some reverse of that. I had a family in Ardmore, Oklahoma. The mother was a Seventh-day Adventist and the father was an atheist. They had a daughter and a son. The daughter took after dad, became an atheist. Son took after mom and became a Christian. But normally it doesn't work that way. It appears that because the boys chose to stay in Moab and married Moabite women, they were influenced by their dad and was taking religion sort of nonchalantly. Not big deal in my life. Verse 5. Another tragedy happened. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. So the woman, Naomi, survived her 2 sons and her husband. Death of her husband and both sons. You can't help but wonder, did those boys die at the same time? Was there some kind of an accident? Or was there some kind of violence? Did they die at the same time, or did they die close together? We don't know. Now we come to the sermon. This is background. Notice verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. This tells us, first of all, that Naomi had kept in touch with her people in Israel. She knew what was going on back home. So even though she had been forced to live in Moab, her heart was back in Israel. She was somehow staying in touch, getting word back somehow. Now, as we think about it, she arose with her daughters-in-law. Did she just now come to her senses, or had this desire to return home been in her heart for 10 years? I think perhaps that her desire had always been to go home. Go back to my church, back to my God. She never allowed herself to adjust to living in a pagan, worldly country with all of its superstitions and all of its paganism. And she was there because she was a dutiful wife and dutiful to her sons, because when her husband died, the sons took over the role of the husband. They were the ones who were making her the living, so she was obligated to the sons. Apparently, now that her sons had died, she was now obligated to no one. Now she could make her own decisions. And it was in her heart to go back to God, go back to Israel, go back to church. Now here's where mother-in-law kicks in. I want you to think about this. Her daughters-in-law were pagans, Moabites. We don't know how long those girls had been married to Naomi's sons. But once Naomi's sons died, where would you normally expect the daughters to go? Husband's dead, no children. Where would you normally expect those girls to go? Home, wouldn't you? Wouldn't that be the normal thing? They'd return to their families. They'd return to their home, their mothers. But apparently, they didn't. Those girls didn't go back home. They chose to stay with their mother-in-law. Can you believe that? Can you imagine you being a young woman, hadn't been married long enough to have children at least, and your husband dies? Can you imagine choosing to live with your mother-in-law rather than your parents, your mother? This is beginning to tell us something about Naomi's character. How long had those girls known Naomi? Several years or just a few months? We don't know. But however long those girls had known Naomi, they must have seen something very attractive. They saw something they had never seen before. What they saw in Naomi didn't exist in the world of Moab. It was a characteristic that was only associated with God, not an idol. It was otherworldly. It was different from anything these girls had ever seen or experienced. It had to be very attractive, it seems to me. It had to be very appealing. It had to be very warm and loving and comforting for those girls to choose to stay with a mother-in-law who had no way of making a living, no way of getting food. Her sons were gone. Naomi didn't work. They chose to take their chances with a mother-in-law instead of going back home where there was family to care for them financially. Look at verse 7. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. Hey, now it's one thing to choose to stay with Naomi as long as she's in Moab. They're close to relatives, they're close to friends. But now Naomi's going to go back to Israel. And can you believe what the Bible says? Those two Moabite girls chose to follow Naomi back to Israel, to a foreign land where they would be strangers in a foreign land, where there was absolutely no future for them. They had no idea what would happen to them there. How would Israel treat them? They had no idea. How would they make a living? How would they eat? How would they survive? They didn't know. What in the world was about Naomi that would cause these girls to be willing to give up all the security they knew and follow their mother-in-law to a strange foreign land? I am looking forward to meeting Naomi. She must have been one special person, because in a short time, she demonstrated a character, a personality, a relationship with her Heavenly Father that drew these two pagan girls to be willing to forsake home, country, friends, relatives, and follow their mother-in-law to another land. It's more than you can see happening today. It defies imagination. What kind of a mother-in-law was she? Not the kind of mother-in-law that most of the stories about that we hear about. Naomi must have demonstrated to these two girls a love that they had never experienced at home. A love that those girls' pagan parents could not share because they didn't have it. It wasn't available to them as pagans, as believers in the superstition, worldly ways. But these two girls, I don't know how old they were. Were they late teenagers? In their 20s? Don't know. But they were so attracted to Naomi that if you go, we're going with you. We're going to take our chances because you are something special. And we're convinced that you have a special relationship with your God. Those girls must have associated Naomi's character with Naomi's faith in God. There must have been a connection there, and those girls recognized it. And those girls saw something far superior than what they'd known in their life, in their homes, in their country. Well, let's look at verse 8. And Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." Naomi's nature is manifesting itself. Go home, girls. I have nothing to offer you. Well, she did, but I don't have anything material to offer you. She didn't wish these girls to experience all the trauma of being in a foreign country like she had experienced in coming to Moab in the first place. She didn't want those girls to have to go through what she'd gone through by going to a foreign land, foreign country. She certainly didn't want these girls following her to Israel because of a sense of duty, like she had felt a sense of duty in following her husband, like she had felt a sense of duty in staying in Moab because of her sons. She didn't want them to feel that sense of duty. You don't come with me because you feel like you're supposed to or you have to. Don't do that. I wouldn't wish that upon you. She doesn't, and this is amazing, Naomi doesn't want to reap any advantage at those girls' disadvantage. Wow. Certainly it would have been comforting to have the two younger women following her and being with her to help her, but she didn't want to reap any advantage over those girls. She didn't want to take advantage of them in any way. Even in her sorrow, she was thinking of others, which leads us to believe that that had been a characteristic of Naomi. Her life demonstrated a caring for others, putting others first and not herself. Naomi must have been a self-sacrificing, loving, giving person. Because she's demonstrating that now by telling the girls, look, girls, I have no idea what the future holds for me. You stay here. Stay with your family. Stay with your friends. Stay with your loved ones. They'll take care of you. Verse 9. Naomi said, the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them. It doesn't say it in the scriptures, but this kiss was a goodbye kiss. She kissed them goodbye. She's releasing them. You have no obligation to stay with me. I'm releasing you. Go back to your families. And look what the girls did. They lifted up their voices and wept at the thought of being separated from this beautiful, loving mother-in-law. These pagan girls wept at the thought of being separated from such a beautiful person. I think Naomi sincerely desired for these girls a better life than she could give them. Now, she knew that God was the source of all good things, and so she prays that the Lord will grant these girls that they will find rest at home, that God will bless them as they stayed in Moab. Apparently, Naomi had talked about her God to these girls, apparently a lot. Because in this separation, she's praying for her God to bless these pagan girls. These girls had seen enough and heard enough of Naomi's religion to appreciate Naomi's prayers for them. Now, as I said, Naomi's kiss was the dismissal. You're free to go. But they wept at the thought of being separated from her. Mothers-in-laws, let me ask you something. Do your children Do your children-in-laws know you love them? I remember a young woman in Phoenix, Arizona. Born out of wedlock. Neither her mother or her father were happy about her coming into existence. She messed up their lives. She messed up all their plans. They were now saddled with a baby. Resentfully saddled with a baby. She grew up in a home where she constantly felt rejected and resented. And like most children following in the example of that kind of a heritage, she got pregnant out of wedlock. She had a baby. And the baby's father married her reluctantly, resentfully. They too had a baby they didn't want. The baby died. She's now living with a husband that she doesn't love and doesn't even like. He doesn't like her either. The only thing that hold together is that baby, and the baby is now gone. She told me, Pastor, I don't know what you're talking about when you talk about love. I have no idea what it's like. I've never experienced love in my whole life. I don't know whether these Moabite girls had experienced any kind of love or not. I suppose they probably had. I'm sure the husbands loved them. I'm sure those boys must have loved them. They certainly didn't marry them because they had a child out of wedlock, because they didn't have any children. So they must have loved them. But anyway, they're experiencing a love from Naomi that excels any kind of love they've ever experienced before. A love that they just are reluctant to give up. I have had the sad experience of knowing mothers who spoke more kindly to the dog and cat and canary than they did to their children. Some parents can only find fault. That's all they see. That's all they talk about. And so I'm asking, do your children-in-laws know you love them? Let's go to verse 10. These two pagan girls said to Naomi, surely we will return with you to your people. Amazing. I know mothers today who would give anything if their daughters would come back to see them. Just once in a while. I know mothers who would give anything in the world if their daughters would just call them once in a while. Or their sons. I'm sorry to say it, but I know mothers whose children never call. Some psychologist said, I don't know who he was now, the way you talk to your children when they're little is the way they're going to talk to you when you're old. Well, 11 and 12 and 13 sort of comes together in a package. So it's got 3 verses together now. Sort of small, but I think you can read the print. Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go. For I'm too old to have a husband. And if I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you wait for them until they grow up? Till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Naomi says, I am sorry for your sakes that you have suffered like you're suffering. The loss of your husbands. And now I'm leaving you. It grieves me that you're having to experience pain because of my going. I'm sorry it's happened this way. I'm sorry you've lost your husbands. I'm sorry that I'm going to go back to my people, and I'm sorry you're going to be left alone to start over again, but please, daughters, go. Notice that last sentence. It grieves me very much. I wish I could do something for you. I wish I could make your life better. I wish I could do something for you. But I can't. I don't have anything. She thought she didn't have anything. Now verse 14. Then the 2 girls lifted up their voices and wept again, cried. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. Tearfully, heartbroken, sad, Orpah decided to take Naomi's advice and go back home. But not Ruth. Ruth could not bring herself to separate from the loving person that Naomi was. And the Bible says Ruth clung to her. Up to this point, there is no reason to doubt the sincerity of Orpah. She loved Naomi. That's why she cried. But what Naomi said made sense. She'd be better off going home than to going with Naomi to a strange country. I think Naomi loved both the girls the same. I think she loved Orpah just as much as she loved Ruth. Both girls felt that love, but one of the girls returned home. We're all free moral agents, and we all have to make choices. There's going to be separations in this life. some of those who are dear to our hearts will decide to turn away from Jesus and the faith. Some will choose not to allow our God to be their God. It will hurt. But we must not allow their choices to change our determination to be faithful to our God. Ruth 1, verse 16. Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." Let me ask you, mothers, something. Would not the expression of some of your loved ones expressing these sentiments, would that not make all of the hard work, all the suffering, all the pain, all the heartache you've endured worthwhile? Your God will be my God. My challenge to not just mothers, not just ladies, but to fathers too, to all of us, that we will choose to so live that not only our family, our loved ones, but those who know us well will someday say, "Your God will be my God."